I don't believe in coincidences. Not anymore. Looking back, it all started with a red envelope that wasn't meant for me. Sarah had been out late the night before, claiming she was at her book club, which she recently joined to reconnect with herself. Book club, right? I'm not the sharpest guy when it comes to literature, but even I know no one reads at a bar until 2 a.m. The envelope appeared on our doorstep the next morning. I found it while grabbing the mail. It was addressed to Sarah with no return address, sealed with wax like some medieval secret. I had no intention of snooping at first, but my curiosity won. Opening someone else's mail is a federal crime. Sure, but so is betraying your husband. Inside was a single sheet of thick, expensive paper. Can't stop thinking about last night. You were incredible. Same time next week. No name, just an initial, D. I sat on the porch, staring at the note as my stomach churned. It wasn't anger yet, just disbelief, like my brain couldn't piece together what my eyes were seeing. This had to be a mistake, right? I convinced myself it was a prank or maybe a misunderstanding. I folded the note back into the envelope, stuck it under my arm, and walked inside like I hadn't just seen the first crack in my world. When Sarah woke up, she was all smiles. She floated into the kitchen wearing one of my t-shirts, humming a song I didn't recognize. The smell of coffee filled the room. She looked so normal, like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't been with someone else last night, whispering things that should have been meant for me. "Morning," she said, kissing me on the cheek. "Morning," I replied, my voice stiff. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to keep calm. "Sleep okay?" she asked, grabbing a mug. "Yeah," I lied, studying her face. "You?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Like a rock," she said, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The envelope sat burning a hole in my mind as I watched her. She poured her coffee, added a splash of oat milk, and sipped it like we weren't living two completely different realities. I decided not to confront her yet. Not until I had more. The rest of the day passed like a storm cloud hanging overhead. I pretended to work in my home office while I replayed the note in my head, wondering who Dee was. I couldn't shake the way she acted so normal. How does someone lie like that? That evening, Sarah told me she was meeting Michelle for dinner. "You're okay with leftovers, right?" she asked, slipping into one of her new dresses, the kind I hadn't seen her wear until recently. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. I waited 10 minutes after she left, then grabbed my keys. My hands shook as I started the car. I didn't even know where I was going, but something told me to follow her. It didn't take long to spot her car in the lot of a cafe across town. I parked and slipped inside, heart pounding like a drum. I didn't see Michelle. Instead, Sarah sat at a corner table, leaning in close to a man I'd never seen before. He had his hand on hers, and the way she looked at him, I hadn't seen that look in years. My chest tightened as I approached, careful to stay hidden behind a nearby column. Then I heard her laugh, soft and flirtatious. The words that followed pierced me like a blade. "You're so much more attentive than he is," she said. He smirked. "Well, your husband doesn't need to know everything, does he?" I froze, my fists clenching at my sides. My world spun as rage and hurt tangled in a storm inside me. But I didn't confront them. Not yet. I had a better idea, one that would destroy their perfect little bubble. I left the cafe, but not before leaving her a gift. It wasn't much, just a napkin with a simple message written in black ink. "Enjoy your evening. You won't forget it. Your husband." As I walked back to my car, I didn't look back. The explosion would come soon enough that I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My head buzzed with a mix of fury and satisfaction. That napkin wasn't just a message, it was a fuse, and I had just lit it. Whatever Sarah thought she was hiding, the game was about to change. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty seat across from me. That seat had been hers for 5 years, filled with laughter, plans, and dreams that now felt like someone else's life. I wanted to scream, to throw the glass against the wall, but I didn't. Not yet. I needed to stay sharp. An hour passed before I heard her car in the driveway. My pulse quickened as the door opened and Sarah walked in, her heels clicking softly on the tile. She paused when she saw me sitting there, her face unreadable. "You're up late," she said, setting her purse on the counter. I swirled the whiskey in my glass. "Couldn't sleep." She nodded, hesitating. Something about her felt different. Her usual confidence was frayed at the edges. She moved to the sink, pretending to rinse her hands, and that's when I saw it. The napkin. She had it clenched in her hand, crumpled but unmistakable. I leaned back in my chair, watching her. "Good dinner?" I asked casually. Sarah froze, her back to me. Slowly, she turned around, her smile as thin as paper. "Yeah, Michelle's doing great. She was a good liar, I'll give her that. But not good enough." "Michelle?" I repeated, nodding. "How is she these days?" Her eyes flickered, searching my face for clues. "You know, same old. We just caught up on life. Girl stuff." I stood, the chair scraping against the floor. "That's funny," I said, walking toward her, "because I swung by that cafe earlier. Didn't see Michelle there. But I did see you." Her face drained of color. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice too calm, too rehearsed. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I snapped, my voice rising. "You and your book club, your dinners with Michelle, your secret notes. How long has it been going on, Sarah? How long have you been lying to me?" She dropped the napkin on the counter, her hands trembling. "It's not what you think," she said quickly, stepping toward me. "Dan's just a friend." "Don't you dare say just a friend," I interrupted, my chest heaving. "I heard you. I saw you. The way you looked at him, the way he touched your hand. Do you even realize how disgusting this is? How disrespectful?" She opened her mouth to argue, but I wasn't done. "And don't even try to gaslight me into thinking I'm imagining it. That napkin? That's my proof, Sarah. I know everything." Her mask cracked then. The confident, carefree Sarah I thought I knew disappeared, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "Fine," she said, her voice icy. "You want the truth? Yeah, I've been seeing Dan. But maybe if you paid half as much attention to me as he does, I wouldn't have to." The words hit me like a slap. I stared at her, stunned. "You're blaming me for this? You're so obsessed with work, your routines, your damn pancakes every Sunday." She shot back, her voice rising. "Do you even realize how boring our life has become? Dan makes me feel alive. He notices me." "Boring?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "Our life is boring? The life I built with you? The one I thought we both wanted. Maybe I didn't know what I wanted," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "But I do now." The room fell silent, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I stared at her, my chest hollow and burning at the same time. The woman I thought I knew, the one I gave everything to, was gone. Finally, I spoke, my voice cold and quiet. "You want Dan? Fine. Have him. But don't think for a second that this ends well for you." Her lip curled, and for a moment, she looked like she might say something else. But she didn't. Instead, she grabbed her purse, her heels clicking against the tile as she stormed out the door, slamming it behind her. I stood there alone, the silence deafening. The cracks in our glass house had finally shattered it completely. The door slammed so hard it rattled the picture frames on the wall, but I didn't move. I stood there, staring at the empty space where Sarah had been moments ago, her words ringing in my ears. "Dan makes me feel alive." Alive? The woman who begged me to work overtime so we could afford our dream home. The woman who cried with me when we couldn't have kids. The woman who held my hand through thick and thin, through failures and triumphs, now said our life was boring. Fine. If she wanted fireworks, I'd give her some. I poured the rest of my whiskey down the drain and grabbed my laptop. The calm that washed over me was unsettling even to myself. My mind was already racing, planning my next move. This wasn't going to end with me being the pathetic husband crying into his pillow. If Sarah thought she could burn me and walk away unscathed, she underestimated just how much I was willing to fight back. I spent hours digging, starting with her social media. I combed through every post, every tagged photo, every comment. I looked for him, Dan. It didn't take long to find him. A handful of vague comments, a couple of likes on photos I didn't remember Sarah posting. But then I hit the jackpot. Dan wasn't just some random fling. He was someone she met through work. Client. I found his LinkedIn profile, his smug face staring back at me like he had already won. His bio was filled with self-congratulatory nonsense about being a visionary and relationship-driven entrepreneur. The irony almost made me laugh. His company's website listed an upcoming gala, an exclusive event for high-profile clients and their plus ones. And wouldn't you know it, the date matched Sarah's next book club meeting. The pieces were falling into place. The next morning, Sarah came home. I heard her heels on the stairs before I saw her. She walked into the kitchen like nothing had happened. Her hair perfectly styled, her lips painted red, a shade she hadn't worn in years. "Morning," she said, reaching for a coffee mug. I didn't respond. Instead, I slid the laptop across the counter, the LinkedIn profile open on the screen. Her hand froze mid-reach. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tight. "Your friend Dan," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You know, the one who makes you feel alive. Thought I'd get to know him better since he's so important to you." Her face paled, but she recovered quickly. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" I said, standing up. "Then explain why you're listed as his guest for that gala next week. Or why he's all over your Instagram likes. Or better yet, why you couldn't even lie to my face last night without crumbling." She tried to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. "You don't have to say anything," I said, grabbing my keys, "because I'm done talking. And when I'm done, Sarah, you're going to regret every second you spent with that loser." "Done with what?" she asked, her voice shaking now. I smirked, something dark rising in me. "You'll see." I walked out before she could say another word. In the car, I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. My lawyer. "Kevin," I said when he picked up, "I need your help. And this time, I want to play dirty." The moment I hung up with Kevin, I knew there was no turning back. My lawyer wasn't just any lawyer. He specialized in high-stakes divorces and corporate takedowns. He was also ruthless, the kind of guy who made sharks look like goldfish. If Sarah thought her little escapades with Dan were going to stay private, she had another thing coming. Kevin was intrigued by my call. He didn't say much, just listened as I laid out the situation. When I mentioned the gala and Dan's name, he interrupted. "Dan Holden? That's him. You know him?" "Oh, I know him," Kevin said, his voice sharp. "I've handled 2 cases involving him before. He's as slimy as they come. Likes to use company money to fund his personal life, hotels, trips, gifts. He's a walking liability." That was all I needed to hear. "Perfect," I said. Kevin chuckled. "You've got something in mind already, don't you?" "I do," I replied. "But I'll need your help to make it bulletproof." Over the next few days, I worked closely with Kevin, piecing together a plan that would expose both Sarah and Dan for what they were. My anger fueled every decision, but I kept my head clear. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my power, and my future. The key to everything was the gala. If Sarah was planning to show up on Dan's arm, she'd have no choice but to drop the mask entirely. But I wasn't just going to let her waltz in and humiliate me by association. No, I was going to be there too. The first step was ensuring I had access to the event. That part was easy. Kevin pulled a few strings and got me an invitation as a guest of one of Dan's competitors. The irony wasn't lost on me. The second step was gathering evidence. Kevin hired a private investigator to follow Sarah and Dan. Within 48 hours, we had photos of them at a hotel, videos of them laughing too closely over dinner, and a copy of a gift receipt Dan had signed for a necklace that I recognized immediately. It was the same one Sarah had started wearing 2 weeks ago. But the piece de resistance? The investigator uncovered financial discrepancies in Dan's company. Charges labeled as client entertainment that were clearly personal expenses. It wasn't just cheating, it was fraud. By the time the day of the gala arrived, I felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. I wore my best suit. The one Sarah used to say made me look like I belonged in a James Bond movie. I didn't feel like Bond, though. I felt like a predator stalking prey. When I arrived at the venue, I scanned the room until I saw them. Dan was tall, obnoxiously handsome, and oozing fake charm. Sarah was on his arm, wearing a dress I'd never seen before. Bright red, plunging neckline. A complete departure from the modest elegance she used to prefer. They looked good together, I'll admit it, But the sight didn't make me jealous. It made me furious. I bided my time, mingling with the crowd and keeping my distance. Then, as the evening wore on, I made my move. Dan and Sarah were chatting with a group of people near the bar when I approached. Sarah's face went pale the moment she saw me. "Evening," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to draw attention. "Mind if I join you?" The group turned to look at me, confusion and curiosity in their eyes. Dan, ever the smooth talker, extended his hand. "You must be Sarah's husband," he said, flashing a grin. "I've heard a lot about you." "Have you?" I replied, ignoring his hand. "That's funny. I've heard a lot about you too, Dan." Sarah stepped forward, her voice low and urgent. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, just enjoying the evening," I said, smiling, "and making sure everyone gets to know the real you too." Before either of them could respond, I raised my voice again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hate to interrupt your evening, but I think it's only fair you know that Dan here has been spending company money on his personal affairs. And my wife, Sarah? Well, she's been helping him." A murmur spread through the group like wildfire. Dan's smile faltered, his confident mask slipping. "This is ridiculous," he said, trying to laugh it off. "Is it?" I said, pulling out my phone. I opened the folder of photos and videos the investigator had gathered, holding it up for the crowd to see. "Because I have plenty of proof." Sarah's face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw real panic in her eyes. "Please stop," she whispered, reaching for my arm. I stepped back, out of her reach. "You should have thought about that before you started lying to me," I said coldly. Dan tried to regain control, but it was too late. The room buzzed with whispers, and several people began pulling out their phones, no doubt spreading the news like wildfire. Security eventually approached, but by then, the damage was done. As I walked out of the venue, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But tonight, the facade had cracked wide open. The drive home from the gala was oddly quiet. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't need the distraction. My thoughts were loud enough. Every now and then, I glanced in the rearview mirror as though expecting someone to follow me, but the road behind stayed empty. It didn't matter. The damage was already done. By the time I pulled into the driveway, exhaustion was catching up with me. Not physical, emotional. I sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the house Sarah and I had made together. Memories flickered through my mind, uninvited and unwelcome. Decorating the living room, arguing over where to hang the TV, drinking wine on the back porch during a summer thunderstorm. It was all gone now, hollowed out by her betrayal. When I walked inside, I wasn't surprised to find Sarah waiting for me. She sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where we'd had countless meals together, her face pale and drawn. The red dress from the gala seemed gaudy under the harsh kitchen light, like a costume that no longer fit the character she was trying to play. "What the hell was that?" she demanded, her voice cracking. I didn't answer right away. I walked to the counter, grabbed a glass, and poured myself some water. The silence dragged on until she couldn't take it anymore. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she said, her voice rising. "You humiliated me. You humiliated us." "Us?" I turned to face her, my laugh cold and bitter. "There hasn't been an us for a long time, Sarah. Not since you decided to sneak around with Dan." "It wasn't like that," she started, but I cut her off. Don't you dare lie to me again. Not after everything I've seen, everything I've heard. Do you even understand the mess you've made? Or were you too busy feeling alive to care?" Her lip trembled, but she clenched her jaw and held her ground. "You think you're some kind of saint? You think you're blameless in all this?" "Blameless?" I stepped closer, my voice low and sharp. "I've spent years building a life for us, sacrificing, compromising, making sure you had everything you needed. And this is how you repay me? By sneaking off with some two-bit con artist." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "You don't understand." "I don't understand?" I slammed the glass down on the counter, the sound echoing through the room. "What exactly don't I understand, Sarah? That you were bored? That you wanted something new? That you didn't have the guts to talk to me like an adult before throwing our marriage away?" She flinched at the word marriage, her tears spilling over. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But it is, I said coldly. This is the reality you chose. And now you get to live with the consequences. Her tears turned to anger. You think you've won, don't you? Showing up at the gala, embarrassing me in front of everyone. What was that supposed to accomplish? Revenge? No, I said, my tone steady. It was about truth. Something you clearly stopped valuing a long time ago. We stood there in silence, the weight of everything between us pressing down like a heavy fog. Finally, she spoke, her voice brittle. So what now? I didn't answer right away. I walked to the drawer where we kept important documents and pulled out the folder I'd prepared. Inside was everything Kevin and I had worked on. Evidence of her affair, proof of Dan's financial fraud, and the divorce papers I'd signed that morning. I dropped the folder on the table in front of her. This, I said, my voice cold and final. This is what's next. I want you out of this house by the end of the week. Take your stuff, take whatever you need, but don't take anything that isn't yours. And don't even think about fighting me on this. You've already lost. She stared at the folder, her hands trembling. You can't be serious, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dead serious, I replied, my gaze unwavering. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of desperation and fury. You're really doing this? I didn't choose this, Sarah. You did. With that, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her sitting alone in the kitchen. The sound of her quiet sobs followed me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. This was just the beginning. The days that followed were a strange mixture of chaos and calm. Sarah stayed in the house, though we barely spoke. The tension between us was suffocating, like the air had turned heavy with all the words we weren't saying. But I didn't care. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crack. She tried, though. Every now and then, she'd test the waters. Do you really think this is the right way to handle things? She asked one morning as I stood by the coffee machine. I didn't even look at her. The right way would have been you not cheating in the first place. We're well past right now. Her sigh was loud, exaggerated, like she wanted me to feel guilty. But I didn't. Not anymore. While Sarah sulked around, I stayed busy. Kevin was working overtime to ensure the divorce would be clean and swift. In the meantime, I focused on tying up loose ends, moving money into separate accounts, gathering my personal belongings, and making sure she couldn't worm her way into anything she didn't deserve. But the fallout wasn't limited to just us. Word of what happened at the gala spread fast. Dan's world was crumbling, and I couldn't have been happier. Kevin had passed along some of the evidence we'd gathered to a few key players in Dan's professional circle. The result? His company launched an internal investigation, and rumors swirled that he might lose his position entirely. Sarah knew about it, of course. She tried to pretend like it didn't bother her, but I could see the cracks forming. She was on edge, snapping at every little thing. One night, she even threw her phone across the room, shattering it against the wall. Was it worth it? I asked, leaning against the doorway. What do you mean? She spat, her voice trembling with anger. Dan, I said simply. Was he worth losing everything? Her face contorted, her anger giving way to something else. Regret, maybe, or shame. But she didn't answer. She just stared at me, her chest rising and falling as though she couldn't find the right words. That silence told me everything I needed to know. By the end of the week, Sarah started packing. I didn't offer to help, didn't even ask where she was going. Part of me thought she'd run straight to Dan, but a small, petty voice in my head hoped he'd shut the door in her face. As she loaded the last of her bags into her car, she turned to look at me one final time. I never meant for it to end like this, she said, her voice softer than I'd heard it in weeks. You never meant to get caught? I corrected, my tone cold. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. Goodbye, Jake, she said finally. I didn't reply. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching as she got into the car and drove away. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet, empty. I walked inside, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I stood in the middle of the living room, unsure of what to do next. But then, something shifted. That silence wasn't suffocating. It was freeing. The absence of her presence felt like a breath of fresh air, a clean slate. I poured myself a drink, sat on the couch, and stared at the empty space where her things used to be. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was relieved. It wasn't over yet. There were still papers to sign, accounts to separate, and a future to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. The day after Sarah left, I woke up feeling lighter, almost as if a physical weight had been lifted off my chest. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I had to watch my back or calculate my words. The house was quiet, peaceful even, though there was still plenty to clean up, both literally and figuratively. But the world doesn't stop spinning just because you've made a personal breakthrough. And in Dan's case, it seemed to spin out of control. Kevin called me that afternoon, his voice brimming with satisfaction. "You're not going to believe this," he said, skipping right over pleasantries. "Dan's company just announced his resignation." I sat up straight. "Resignation? That's fast." "It's not just that," Kevin continued, a grin in his tone. "The investigation uncovered some serious financial misconduct. They're handing everything over to law enforcement. If he's lucky, he'll just face fines. If not, well, jail isn't off the table." I leaned back in my chair, the corners of my mouth curling into a smile. Good. Couldn't have happened to a more deserving guy. But Kevin wasn't done. "There's more," he said. "Apparently, his wife found out about the affair. She's filed for divorce and is going after him for everything she can." I blinked. "Wait, Dan was married." "Oh yeah," Kevin said with a laugh. "3 kids, white picket fence, the whole 9 yards. He's about to lose it all." Hearing that Dan's world was crumbling felt better than I expected. It wasn't just petty satisfaction, it was justice. He'd been arrogant enough to think he could steal someone else's wife, ruin multiple lives, and walk away unscathed. Now the tables had turned and he was paying the price. Later that evening, I got an unexpected message from an unknown number. "Hi Jake, this is Anna, Dan's wife. Can we talk?" For a moment, I just stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Curiosity won out. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Her reply came quickly. "I heard about what happened at the gala. I wanted to thank you. If you hadn't exposed him, I don't know how much longer I'd have been in the dark. I'm sorry for what you went through, but you should know you weren't the only one he betrayed." Her words hit me harder than I expected. It was one thing to know Dan was a scumbag. It was another to realize just how many people he'd hurt in the process. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," I replied. "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Anna didn't respond right away, but when she did, her message was short and to the point. "You've done enough. Thank you for standing up for yourself. And for me." I sat back, letting the conversation sink in. The tangled web Sarah and Dan had woven was unraveling, and everyone involved was feeling the sting. The next day, I got another surprise. Sarah called me. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. "Jake," she said when I answered, her voice hesitant. "What do you want, Sarah?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. I wanted to talk, to explain." "There's nothing left to explain," I said firmly. "You made your choices, and now you're living with them." "I didn't know he was married," she blurted out, her voice cracking. "I didn't know about his wife or his kids. He lied to me too." I sighed, the smallest pang of pity creeping in. "And you think that makes it better? You still lied to me, Sarah. You still cheated. Whatever Dan told you doesn't change that." "I know," she said quietly. "I know I messed up. I don't know what to do anymore." For the first time in weeks, I felt nothing for her. Not anger, not sadness, not love. Just emptiness. "That's not my problem," I said. "You need to figure it out on your own." She started to say something else, but I ended the call. As I set the phone down, a strange sense of peace washed over me. The chaos, the betrayal, the lies. It was all behind me now. Sarah and Dan could deal with the mess they'd created, but I was done. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. A week passed after Sarah's phone call. Life started to feel normal, or at least as close to normal as it could after everything that had happened. The divorce was moving forward quickly, thanks to Kevin's meticulous work. I stayed busy, throwing myself into projects at work and reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen much since my marriage became a war zone. But the past doesn't let go so easily. One afternoon, as I was walking out of the gym, I spotted Sarah sitting on a bench near the parking lot. Her hair was tied back, and she looked pale, thinner than I remembered. She was staring at her phone, her expression blank, almost hollow. I debated walking past her, pretending I hadn't seen her, but she looked up at the last second. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then she stood, clutching her bag nervously. "Jake," she said, her voice hesitant. I nodded but didn't say anything. "Can we talk?" she asked, shifting on her feet. I exhaled, feeling the weight of her presence. "About what?" She hesitated, then said, "Everything." I didn't want to, but something about the way she looked, lost, desperate, made me nod. "Fine. 5 minutes," I said. We walked to a nearby coffee shop, sitting at a corner table away from the other customers. I folded my arms, waiting for her to start. "Dan's gone," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Gone." She nodded. "He's been staying at some hotel since his wife kicked him out, but now he's just disappeared. His phone's off, his email bounces back. I don't know where he is." I couldn't help the small smirk that tugged at my lips. "So much for your Prince Charming." Her face twisted in frustration. "This isn't funny, Jake." "You're right. It's pathetic." I shot back. "You threw away our marriage for a man who didn't even have the decency to stick around when things got hard." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't soften. "I didn't know who he really was," she whispered. "I thought he cared about me." "Sarah," I said, leaning forward, "he didn't care about you. He cared about what you gave him, a distraction, an ego boost, whatever. But care? No. If he cared, he wouldn't have lied to you or used you as a pawn in his own mess." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy. But then I remembered everything. Her lies, her betrayal, the nights I spent doubting myself because of her. "You don't get to cry about this," I said, my voice cold. "You made your choice, Sarah. You chose him. And now you're dealing with the consequences." She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "I've lost everything, Jake. My job's on the line because of this. People at work are talking about me, about us. My reputation is ruined. I don't know what to do." "That's not my problem," I said, standing. "You ruined your reputation, not me. And you lost everything because you decided what we had wasn't enough." Her hand reached out, grabbing my arm. "Jake, please. I need your help." I pulled away, shaking my head. "You need to help yourself, Sarah. I can't save you from this." "I won't." I left her sitting there, broken and alone. Walking out of that coffee shop felt like closing a door, locking it and throwing away the key. When I got home, I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch, letting the quiet settle around me. I didn't feel triumphant or victorious. I felt done. Done with her, with Dan, with the entire mess they dragged me into. The next morning, I got a text from Kevin. "Sarah's attorney reached out. She wants to settle." I stared at the message, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Finally," I muttered, tossing the phone onto the couch. The war was over. I'd won. The news that Sarah wanted to settle hit me like the first breath of air after surfacing from deep water. I didn't reply to Kevin right away. Instead, I sat there, staring at my phone, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it, the final step to severing the ties that had once bound me to her. When I called Kevin back, his tone was as crisp and efficient as ever. "It's a clean offer," he said. "She's not fighting for the house or alimony. She just wants to split the assets and move on." I blinked, surprised. "That's unexpected." "She knows she has no leverage," Kevin replied. "The evidence we gathered is enough to sink her in court if she tries to push for more. Honestly, Jake, this is as good as it gets. Take it." I didn't hesitate. "Do it." The paperwork was finalized within days. It was surreal, signing my name on the dotted line and officially closing the book on my marriage. I expected to feel sadness, regret, or even anger, but instead, I felt relief. A week after the settlement was finalized, I came home to find a small box on my doorstep. No note, no return address. I carried it inside, my curiosity piqued. Inside were a few items I hadn't seen in months. A watch I thought I'd lost, a framed photo of Sarah and me from our honeymoon, and a folded piece of paper. I opened the paper and recognized Sarah's handwriting immediately. Jake, I don't expect forgiveness and I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted to return these. They belong to you. I'm sorry for everything. For the lies, the betrayal, and for taking you for granted. I hope someday you find someone who gives you the love and respect you deserve. You're a good man, even if I didn't treat you like one. Take care of yourself. Sarah, I set the note down, staring at it for a long moment. A part of me wanted to rip it up, throw it away, and forget it ever existed. But another part, the part that still clung to the good memories we'd shared, stopped me. I folded the note neatly and placed it back in the box. Then I put the box in the back of my closet, where it could gather dust alongside the past. That night, I poured myself a drink and sat on the porch, watching the stars. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to think about the future. What it could look like without her, without the pain and anger I'd carried for so long. The next day, I called up an old friend I hadn't seen in years. We made plans to grab lunch, catch up, and laugh about simpler times. It felt like a step forward, a reminder that life was still waiting for me. The divorce didn't just end a marriage. It gave me back a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Months passed, and with every day that went by, the wounds left by Sarah's betrayal began to heal. The scars were there, sure, but they no longer throbbed with the raw pain they once held. Instead, they became reminders of lessons learned, of resilience, of the person I'd become in the wake of it all. I threw myself into rebuilding my life. The house, which once felt empty and cold after Sarah left, became my sanctuary. I repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and even adopted a dog, a goofy golden retriever I named Max. His wagging tail and clumsy antics brought a joy I hadn't felt in years. The divorce had been finalized for months now, and Sarah faded further into the background with each passing day. Occasionally, I'd hear about her through mutual acquaintances. She'd moved to a smaller apartment across town and was working to rebuild her career. Dan, predictably, had vanished, leaving her to clean up the wreckage of her choices. But I didn't dwell on her anymore. My focus was on myself, on who I was and who I wanted to be. One Friday night, a friend convinced me to join him at a local bar for trivia night. I almost declined, tempted to stay home with Max and a movie, but something nudged me to go. The bar was crowded and buzzing with energy. Groups huddled around tables, shouting answers and laughing over drinks. I hadn't done something like this in years, and it felt good to be surrounded by people again. Halfway through the night, our team was struggling with a question about classic movies. I was about to give up when a voice behind me said, "The answer is Casablanca." I turned to see a woman standing there, a playful smile on her face. She was striking, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Are you sure?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Positive," she replied confidently. "It's my favorite movie." We submitted the answer and got it right. Our team cheered, and I turned back to thank her. "I'm Jake," I said, extending a hand. "Emily," she replied, shaking it. We started talking, and before I knew it, the trivia night was over, but neither of us had moved from the bar. She was smart, funny, and refreshingly straightforward. Everything I hadn't realized I was looking for. As the night wound down, she handed me her number, her smile warm and inviting. "Call me," she said simply. I watched her walk out, a strange mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling in my chest. It wasn't love at first sight. I wasn't naive enough to believe in that anymore, but it was something good. The next morning, I found myself grinning as I texted her. "Hey, it's Jake from Trivia. Wanna grab coffee sometime?" Her reply came quickly. "How about tomorrow?" I stared at the screen, my grin widening. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't seem so uncertain. It didn't matter what had happened before or how broken I'd felt. Life wasn't just moving on, it was moving forward, and so was I. As I closed my phone and looked down at Max, who was wagging his tail like he knew something good was coming. I felt a surge of gratitude. For the lessons, the growth, the chance to start over. And for the first time in years, I felt truly alive.